There are some stories we hear, and they leave us with that nagging feeling in the back of our minds, like this one. Gigantic beings walking the earth, as if they were part of the ancient world. Sounds like a legend, right? But what if I told you the Bible actually talks about them and more? They weren't just a few, and they weren't all the same. There are ancient accounts of entire clans, beings of enormous height, extraordinary strength, and an origin that still confuses scholars today. Who were these beings? Where did they come from? And what happened to them after the flood? Many believe giants were just metaphors or exaggerations. But when you connect the dots, not just from the Bible, but also from ancient traditions, forgotten manuscripts, and even controversial archaeological findings, a much more complex and terrifying picture begins to form. In this video, you'll dive into a fascinating investigation. We're going to uncover who the real biblical giants were, not the ones from the movies, but those who left deep footprints in human history, and maybe even in places you'd never imagine. Get ready, because what's coming might flip your worldview, and maybe you'll never read certain Bible passages the same way again. They say humanity's story began in Eden, but few know that in the shadows of that narrative, a mystery emerged that echoes to this day: the giants. According to the Bible, they weren't just enormous creatures, they were the result of a forbidden union, the Nephilim, born of something that defies any logical explanation. The offspring of fallen angels and human women. What drove these celestial beings to break the barrier between the invisible and the physical? What were they really after? This nearly forgotten origin is described in Genesis 6, but it's rarely taught in depth. Picture the scene: angelic beings descending to earth, choosing human wives, giving birth to hybrid offspring with colossal strength and supernatural presence. If this reminds you of sci-fi movies, you're not alone. But this isn't fiction. It's the Bible, revealing a celestial rebellion with physical and spiritual consequences. And the strangest part, these creatures disappeared with the flood. Or did they? Because after the waters receded and Noah restarted humanity's story, there they were again. The giants. How is that possible? Many scholars believe there was a second celestial interference, or perhaps preserved bloodlines. What does this reveal? That the war between heaven and earth didn't stop. It just became more subtle. And that raises an unsettling question. If they returned back then, could they return in our time too? But before diving into that disturbing possibility, we need to better understand who these post-flood giants were. They didn't appear out of nowhere. They had names, territories, and histories. And that's exactly where the mystery deepens. When the flood survivors began their new lives, they had no idea they'd still have to face beings as colossal as they were ancient. The Bible states that the giants didn't completely vanish. Quite the opposite. Some specific races survived or reappeared and began inhabiting strategic regions of the Middle East. The Nephilim, or rather their descendants, now had proper names. They were the Rephaim, Anakim, Emim, Zuzim, and Zamzumim. Each tribe brought not only immense stature but also a deep spiritual weight. The Rephaim, for example, were seen almost like the undead. Their name is linked to death, to the spirit world, as if they were shadows of what they once were. King Og of Bashan is described as one of the last of these beings, nearly 5 meters tall. Imagine a man twice the height of a standard door, ruling over entire cities. He wasn't just a military threat, but a spiritual presence that instilled fear simply by existing. The Anakim were known as the sons of the sky. They were described by the spies sent by Moses as terrifying, gigantic, almost invincible. They represented a purer form of Nephilim and were feared because of it. Emim and Zuzim, in turn, were named after human emotions, terror and strength. The Emim roared like lions and caused panic. The Zuzim were nearly indestructible until an army led by Chedorlaomer wiped them out, and finally the Zamzumim, who lived east of the Jordan and vanished without a trace, seem to have been erased from history by invisible hands. It's as if these tribes were scattered like pieces of a larger puzzle, each one guarding secrets, territories, and remnants of a plan humanity forgot. But the more we investigate these tribes, the more we realize the giants were much more than oversized beings. They carried a spiritual, symbolic, and perhaps prophetic legacy. And when you look at how they were treated in ancient texts, a new layer of mystery emerges. Behind the stories of wars and lands, there's something few notice. The giants of the Bible weren't just warriors of flesh and bone. They were visible signs of an invisible rebellion. The Nephilim origin of these beings pointed to a spiritual conflict that began long before humanity even existed. Yes, they were descendants of fallen angels, but also symbols of a deep rupture between heaven and earth. Their existence carried a cosmic weight, a living reminder that celestial forces still interfere in the human realm. Many ancient accounts show that these giants were treated like gods, not because they were divine, but because they seemed larger than life. Ancient peoples worshipped them, feared them, made sacrifices to them, as if, in the absence of the true God, humanity sought tangible idols, even if terrifying ones. And that leads to a powerful reflection. Even today, how often do we trade the spiritual and eternal for figures that represent fear, control, or status? The cycle repeats, only the names change. These giants, then, were more than battlefield enemies. They were spiritual barriers. In many biblical passages, every encounter with a giant is preceded by a crisis of faith, a hesitation, a doubt. David didn't defeat Goliath with just a stone. He overcame fear, cowardice, and his people's sense of inferiority. That giant was also a metaphor for what paralyzes the spirit, which leads to the question, what spiritual giants are holding us back today? But before we explore how those battles unfolded in biblical stories and what they mean for our own lives, we need to revisit the epic confrontations that marked the clash between ordinary men and seemingly invincible forces. Because it was in the heat of these conflicts that the masks of the giants began to fall. When the Bible tells of the conflicts between the Israelites and the tribes of giants, it's not just recounting war stories. It's describing battles that symbolize the clash between faith and fear, between divine promise and visible threats. The Israelites knew they weren't just facing armies, but historic monsters, descendants of the Nephilim, with size and strength that seemed impossible to overcome. And yet, they did. Because the battle wasn't only with swords, it was with belief, courage, and trust in something greater. The accounts are striking. The spies sent to Canaan returned terrified by the Anakim. They said, "We seemed like grasshoppers in their eyes." That moment reveals something beyond the narrative. It's about how we perceive our own limits when facing challenges. Sometimes the giant isn't out there, it's inside. And here's something practical. When you're facing a gigantic problem, whether it's trauma, debt, or a hard decision, ask yourself, am I acting like the fearful spies or like David? It's interesting to see that these giants always occupied key regions, places with access to trade routes, water sources, or surrounded by myths. They weren't just anywhere. It's as if they were placed there to stop the chosen people's progress, physically and spiritually. This still happens today. Many modern giants stand between us and our goals: bureaucracy, addictions, toxic relationships, social expectations. And defeating them takes more than strength. It requires discernment and faith. But there's an even deeper layer to this mystery. Why do so many cultures around the world report the existence of giants in their stories? Is the Bible alone in this narrative? Or are we looking at a collective memory scattered among Earth's peoples? It's fascinating how different civilizations, separated by oceans and millennia, speak of colossal beings in their traditions. The Bible mentions giants descended from the Nephilim, but what about the Greeks and their Titans, or the Norse with their Jotuns? Even the Hindus have their Asuras. It doesn't seem like a coincidence. It's as if humanity, in many languages, is telling the same story of massive beings, almost divine, who challenged the heavens and fell. The mystery is, who influenced whom? Or is everyone just trying to remember the same thing? These giants aren't just big. They represent something: destruction, forbidden knowledge, war, chaos. And that says a lot about how humans see their own limits. When we feel crushed by something, a tragedy, a crisis, a social or emotional force, we project it as a giant. That's how these myths are born, to explain the unexplained, to name what dominates us, as if fear took on shape and height. But look how curious, we still do this today. Only now, the giants have new names. Today they're called anxiety, depression, financial crisis, burnout. They're not 3 meters tall, but they crush hearts, destroy dreams, and terrify entire families. And that's where biblical symbolism becomes incredibly relevant. The giants of the Bible aren't trapped in the past. They're still alive, just disguised as modern problems. And defeating them takes a battle just like David's, with faith, strategy, and courage. But what if these giants are also mirrors? Mirrors of something we carry inside, something ancient, deep, hidden. Maybe the secret to defeating them isn't in myths from around the world, but in the monsters living within us. What if the giants of the Bible are more than historical characters or supernatural beings? What if they're reflections of something inside each of us? Carl Jung would call them archetypes, symbolic images from the collective unconscious. The Nephilim and their descendants may represent inner forces that challenge us daily: pride that dominates, arrogance that distances, greed that consumes. Invisible giants, but ever present. How many times have you felt like a simple decision was impossible, that fear paralyzed you, that something inside screamed louder than reason? These are the moments when our inner giants show up. They don't come with armor or swords. They show up as voices, impulses, uncontrollable desires. And it doesn't matter your age, your faith, or your physical strength. If you don't recognize them, they defeat you from within. In the Bible, entering the promised land required defeating these giants. That's deeply symbolic. Because reaching something greater in life, a purpose, a real change, a spiritual calling, always demands facing the inner forces that block you. Fear of failure, judgment, rejection, they're there, lurking, just like the Rephaim were in Israel's path. And only those who face those shadows make it to the other side. Now think, what giant do you need to defeat today? What force inside you has been holding you back? Because maybe before looking outward for answers, you need to look inward and prepare for the greatest battle of your life. But not everything is about how we feel. Some of these giants have already taken physical form and control entire systems in our modern world. Today, the giants don't carry spears or wear armor. They wear suits, write code, control data, and craft narratives. The Bible warned us about beings who ruled entire lands. And in our world, these giants are corporations, governments, and technologies that know everything about us. They don't have Nephilim blood, but they control what we see, what we think, even how we feel. They're invisible giants, present in every click, every notification, every algorithm. Think about it. What are Google, China, Amazon, and artificial intelligence, if not colossal structures, with power over nations and minds? They shape cultures, create needs, and gradually replace autonomy with convenience. Today, the sons of gods don't come from the sky as angels. They're born in biotech labs, carry chips, and respond with terrifying precision. Modern hybrids aren't made of flesh and spirit, but of neurons and circuits. And this new generation of giants also brings fear. Artificial intelligence, for example, frightens many people. It learns fast, makes decisions, mimics emotions. And when combined with biotechnology, we're creating something not even science fully understands. Doesn't that remind you of the Nephilim stories? Beings that crossed boundaries that should never have been crossed. Now, who's to say we're not making the same mistake, just with new tools? The question is, are we ready to face these modern giants, or are we, like the ancients, seeing them as gods, untouchable, unquestionable? Because if history repeats itself, and it always does, maybe it's time to recover ancient wisdom to understand what we're building today and what that might mean for our future. So now, after all of this, tell me, what do you feel? Because you can't hear these stories and remain the same, can you? Knowing that giants really existed, that the Bible talks about them, and that so much may have been hidden from us, sparks a huge desire to understand more, to go beyond what we've always been told. Maybe these giants aren't that far away. Maybe they're closer than we think. If you felt you learned something new here, if something touched you deep inside, take this moment. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and stick with us, because there's still so much no one has told you yet, and we're going to discover it together.